Hello, Liberty University students. My name is Ronald Picciarelli, and my Research Week talk is titled Fire and Fury, the Effectiveness of Permanent Fortifications in the United States Civil War. I became interested in this topic because I happen to like forts, but also in the course of my studies in the U.S. Civil War, I came across some boastful statements from various generals and admirals that said that no fort could resist the power of the rifled cannon. It's like, and it got me thinking, well, perhaps these military men are kind of misunderstanding the form and function of a fort. Um, Forts have a long history in the world and in the United States. And there have been some very famous fortifications in the United States, such as this one. Um, this fort is called Fort McHenry, and its defense was the inspiration for the United States national anthem. Fortifications were heavily influenced by a French military engineer of the 17th century and early 18th century, and his name was Sebastien Lepresteur de Vauban, or just called Vauban. Vauban wrote a textbook titled A Manual of Siegecraft and Fortification. And in his textbook, he elevates the science of building fortifications to real engineering skill. And he also gives some new terminology to parts of forts. In Vauban's fortifications, he makes fortifications with these new parts here. These are called bastions. And this word bastion has come into the English language as being like a strong point, and he uses these as forts within a fort. And as we'll see, Vauban's ideas and his engineering techniques were very influential. In A Manual of Siegecraft and Fortification, Sebastien Lepresteur de Vauban discusses how long a fort should be able to hold out against an attacking force. And basically, the no fort has ever been designed to hold out indefinitely against an attacking force. That to hold out indefinitely against an attacking force is just something that forts are not designed to do. Forts are designed for various purposes. They're designed to slow down an attacking force and soak up some of its resources with time. And in this time, the defending force will gather their own resources and field armies and counterattack the attacking force. So forts are designed, well, many of them are designed to slow down an attacking force and soak up the resources of an attacking army. Vauban, he estimates that a simple fortification without a field army defending it can hold out against an attacking force for about 15 to 20 days. Not indefinitely, 15 to 20 days. And that timeline will be pretty important as we look at the permanent fortifications and their effectiveness in the United States Civil War. There were three incidents in the 19th century that had an effect on people's ideas about fortifications in the United States Civil War. The first one was during the War of 1812, where this Fort McHenry, survived about a 24-hour or so bombardment by the British Navy and became the inspiration for the United States national anthem. But and then the British Navy sailed away. You could see with the design of this fort, you have these little things sticking out. These are the bastions. They were the strong points of the fort. And they're obviously influenced by Vauban and his textbook. But also, I think that some people, because they saw Fort McHenry hold out after a one-day bombardment, they came to this erroneous belief that all fortifications should be able to hold out indefinitely against an attacking force. And that's just not the way they've ever been designed. The next kind of occasion in historical example in the 19th century was during the Mexican War, where General Scott landed a force on the Mexican coast by Veracruz and besieged a Mexican fortress named San Juan de Aula. In a great primary source titled An artillery officer in the Mexican War, Robert Anderson, discusses the attack on Veracruz. And the attack is not something special or anything. They use the methods that were used during Vauban's time to attack and get up closer to the walls of this Mexican fort. And what Anderson says is that at night they have engineers, also called sappers, that dig saps or trenches along the ground, and the trenches are made in a zigzag pattern to get a little bit closer to the wall of the fort. And after a few days of digging at night, these sappers then dig what's called a parallel, and they connect different saps, and these parallels are parallel to the walls of the fort, and the artillery is moved up into the parallels, and they get a little closer to the fort, and they keep bombarding the walls of the fort. Well, after 15 days of digging their saps and making parallels, the Mexican fort of San Juan de Aula surrenders. They see the Americans are just right outside the walls. The walls aren't destroyed or anything. They just surrender. So 15 days. That sure falls within the estimated time that Vauban said in his textbook, 15 to 20 days of that a fort is expected to hold out. The next incident is the Crimean War, where three major European powers fought over the fortifications of Sevastopol. Sevastopol was besieged by British and French forces. They dug their own saps and parallels, and it seemed to take them a long time. After 9 months of digging saps and parallels and besieging the fortress of Sevastopol, an infantry attack jumps out of the parallels, and they go for the walls of the fortifications, and they climb the walls, and they take the walls of the fort, and the Russian forces retreat and surrender the city of Sevastopol after 9 months. Well outside the 15 to 20 days, or even longer times if there was a big field army that was defending the fortification that Vauban estimated. Right after the Crimean War, a new type of cannon was developed. It was the rifled cannon. And a rifled cannon is a little bit different from a regular cannon that uses just a round cannonball. A rifled cannon puts rifling or little grooves inside the barrel of the cannon, and usually the shot from this new type of cannon was shaped more like a bullet than just a round cannonball. And as it was shot out of a rifled cannon, it would give a spin to that shaped charge, and it would hit a masonry wall. Well, the British did tests on these new rifled cannons, and the tests were within, 60 to 100 yards of a masonry fortification. And they found that at that close distance, the even one shot at a masonry wall would cause masonry to crack and break and fall apart. Even extremely thick masonry, if it was hit repeatedly in the same spot, would eventually just get a breach or a hole through the wall. Well, these new rifled cannons had never been used in a combat situation. And theoretically, some admirals said if we had a fleet that had rifled cannon on it, we could bombard these forts and they would have to surrender because no masonry fortification could hold out against this newfangled rifled cannon. We have in the United States Civil War Admiral Dahlgren here, who does invent cannons, but the Dahlgren cannon is not a rifle cannon. The Dahlgren cannon is a very effective cannon. It's used on ships, but it's not the kind of rifle cannon that was like a Parrott rifle that people envisioned a fleet to be armed with. In fact, there weren't any tests done on rifled cannon put onto Navy ships and then bombarding in a fort in any tests. It was all just theoretical. If they were there, then they would be able to take a fort easily. Well, this had never been done, and it really never was done during the U.S. Civil War. What we do see during the U.S. Civil War is kind of the time-honored tactics. In my research report, I'm using 4 case studies of different fortifications in the United States Civil War. We'll use Fort Pulaski, Forts Jackson and St. Philip, and Fort Macon in Georgia. And these forts are permanent seacoast fortifications located along the seacoast here. And here's Fort Pulaski, Fort Macon, Forts Jackson and St. Philip in these various locations. And United States Navy and Army did what's called combined operations in order to take these fortifications. And lo and behold, some generals and admirals saying, well, no fortification can hold out against a rifled cannon. Well, they weren't designed to ever do that sort of thing. In my first case study, we look at Fort Pulaski. It's a Confederate fort. It had been a Union fort, but then it changed sides, and the Confederates had a garrison of 358 soldiers in it. And Fort Pulaski is on an island right outside of Savannah, Georgia, and it's guarding the Savannah River. Well, Union generals land at a nearby island, and they start digging gun emplacements to bombard this fort. They build saps. They make parallels on this little island. They get closer as they could on the smaller island to get just a little closer to Fort Pulaski's defenses. They have to dig at night. They don't want the Confederates to know what they're doing, and they cover up their work during the day with brush. After 47 days of digging, they get their guns in place and they start bombarding the Confederate fort, and it's a pretty effective bombardment. It takes 2 days to bombard the fort, and the fort surrenders. I guess the Confederate garrison was very worried that they were going to not be able to hold out against this Union force, but they surrender after 47 days. Now, 47 days is, well outside of Vauban's timeline, 15 to 20 days. If we say, well, the sappers can only work at night, so, if they're not working during the day, then we'll cut it down to 23 days, 23 and a half days. It's like, well, that's kind of splitting hairs, but nonetheless, um, Fort Pulaski surrendered rather than just get bombarded into submission. The next forts we look at were attacked in April of 1862, and they're located along the Mississippi River. And they're fairly old forts. One is called Fort Jackson, which is newer than Fort St. Philip, which is an old Spanish fort that was made during the uh, late 1700s. Um, what happens with these two forts is that Admiral Farragut takes the Union Navy and he runs the gauntlet in between these forts and gets through with just a few shots being fired. But coming behind Admiral Farragut is Admiral Porter, who's got a newfangled invention. He put mortars on rafts, and he gets them next to the forts, and he starts bombarding the forts. He starts bombarding Fort Jackson. It's a newer fort, and after 12 days of bombardments, the fort's garrison has had enough. The fort's garrison had very poor morale. The fort walls weren't breached or anything, but just that there was like a mutiny among the garrison of Fort Jackson, and they surrender the fort after 12 days of bombardment. Fort St. Philip has the same fate. The garrison has, very terrible morale. And rather than fight it out and hold the fort till the last man, they have their own mini mutiny and they surrender the fort the very next day. So Admiral Porter's mortar rafts don't actually bombard the walls of the fort. What they do is they shoot the mortars over top of the walls of the fort to hit on the inside. So technically, they're not hitting the walls of the fort trying to cause a breach. They do have infantry, which lands outside the forts and is ready to attack if there was any breach made or a hole in the walls of the fort. But this is never done. The forts surrender. The last fort that we look at is Fort Macon in Georgia. And this is a little bit different fort. Fort Macon doesn't have exposed masonry. There's just these outer land defenses that are built up so high that it's very difficult to hit the masonry of the fort itself. But here we have General Burnside with his force, and what he does is he has his sappers go out there and they dig their saps in zigzag pattern. They make parallels, and after about 10 days they bombard the fort, and they do cause part of the fort to part of the wall of the fort to crumble. The very next day, the Union infantry is ready to go into the fort, get through the breach, but after 12 days, the garrison of this fort surrenders. So we have these 4 case studies on early war permanent fortifications of the United States Civil War. And we see that as we look at them, and we look at the time it takes for them to either surrender or for infantry to possibly go through a breach that's created. We look at the average time to take each of these forts is 21 days. Now remember, in Vauban's estimate, without any kind of like a field army defending a fort, just a simple fort out there, it would take 15 to 20 days to cause a breach and be able to take a fort. So these fortifications last within the time limit that Vauban estimates. In fact, 21 days is over the time limit that Vauban estimated fortifications to hold out against an attacking force. So our conclusion would be that instead of looking at a fortification as some sort of some sort of bastion that's going to hold out indefinitely, we have to look at their form and their function. And their function is to hold up an attacking force. So the defenders can create a defensive field army to counterattack. Well, in most of these cases, the Confederates do not make any kind of field army to defensively counterattack after these forts fall. So these forts are like a defense, but there's no time being given to the defenders to counterattack. So they're kind of out there on their own, and I mean it's no wonder why the garrison at Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip just surrendered. It was just a group of men trapped inside a fort being bombarded. So 21 days. These permanent fortifications, they certainly do fall within the time estimates that Vauban estimated that fortifications should hold out for, not indefinitely, 15 to 20 days, Vauban estimated. The average time for these four forts was 21 days. So we can conclude that they lived up to their design expectations. So if you have other questions about other fortifications that were attacked later on in the United States Civil War, such as the fortifications around Mobile, Alabama, or Fort Sumter, we can talk about those if you ask a question about them. So I thank you for your time and for listening to Fire and Fury, the effectiveness of permanent fortifications in the United States Civil War. Good night.